Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. We are the Estes Valley Watershed Coalition. And I know some old friends here, and I see some new faces. So welcome, everybody. The Watershed Coalition formed in about 2014, right after the flood of 2013, to repair all of the damage that the flood did. And that included repairing the river channels, which had been basically washed into rushing rivers. We put the meanders back and replanted riparian areas. And we're still at it today. That was about a $4.5 million investment, thanks to state and federal grants. And today, we're still at the job of keeping our environment safe from fires. So we do a lot of fire mitigation. We contract with the experts, and they go out in the field and cut the beetle kill trees and remove them or burn piles. Anyway, that's what we're doing today, but we invite you, if you're not a member, to become one and be a caretaker of the environment with us. We ask for little donations if you can, simply because when we get grants, the grant will ask for in-kind support. So that's where that happens. There's a box up there for donations if you're interested. Tonight we have Ken Kassenbrock, who is a self-proclaimed mushroom tracker and fungi forager. Thanks for coming, Ken. Please.
My pleasure. So, is my microphone functional? Can people hear me? Okay. I can speak louder in the room, and this mic I don't have any volume control on, so I'll just. Well, do I need it?
No. Yes.
One yes, and I can usually speak pretty loudly. Let's try it, but if it doesn't work, I.
Okay. All right.
So we're going to learn some mycology tonight. So I used to teach mycology at CSU for a number of years. I'm retired, but now I have a new audience. So we're gonna learn some mycology this evening. Okay, so we're going to talk about what exactly are fungi and why should we care, and what do fungi do, and these things are related. What are the roles of fungi in local and global environments? And the reason that we should care about them is basically because of what they do. They interact hugely with plants and even animals throughout the world, throughout ecosystems. So even though we don't always see them, they matter a lot. Okay, so what exactly are fungi, mushrooms, molds, and more? You see some pretty molds and dishes here, and here's some brewer's yeast. This is I believe, a big open vat of beer being stirred there, and a pretty poster of some mushrooms. We'll talk about mushrooms, but not only about mushrooms. Okay, so we're going to start pretty basic and then get more into interactions of fungi with other organisms. But the key thing is our view of fungi has changed and continues to change. So for centuries, we thought fungi were plants, and they were studied, and still they're studied in botany departments to this day in the United States and most countries. So it was really only in 1969 that we realized fungi were a separate kingdom, that they weren't plants. And And for me, I can still remember 1969. So that's, some of you may as well. So it's not that long ago that we made a really fundamental change in our thinking about what fungi are. So these are just some pictures of things this is a book I used to teach out of called The Fifth Kingdom. And here's this photographer, Taylor Lockwood, is a professional photographer who takes wonderful pictures of mushrooms. And I've just stolen this picture off the internet. So, but he's a fabulous photographer. Okay, so most fungi are microscopic, so we don't really see them. And they're, as we'll see, they're distinct from other microorganisms like bacteria. Okay, they're different. And the surprising thing that we found out just, again, really recently, in the 90s, in fact, is that fungi are actually more closely related to animals than they are to plants. So that was a big surprise. So here's a couple of diagrams just sort of showing that fact, some tree diagrams showing that animal and fungi are their closest neighbor. Again, here animals and fungi are their closest neighbors, and plants are farther away. Plants are further separated. And the same, and this is a kind of a fun diagram up here. Animals and mushrooms and plants are over here. So not the way you'd think of it. So here's one of the pieces of evidence. Animals and fungi are each other's closest relatives, congruent evidence from multiple proteins. So this was 1993. So it was really just in the 90s from sort of sequence evidence that we figured out exactly where things should lie. Okay, so what are fungi? First, they're eukaryotes, and so any multicellular organism, those are all eukaryotes, so anything big. And if you had to ever study the parts of a cell, back in the cell that you were looking at was a eukaryote, that it would have a nucleus and mitochondria and those kinds of things. So that's the group that we're in. And then the other group are bacteria and archaea that are much smaller and don't have those little compartments. Okay. Fungi have cell walls, which plants do, but animals don't. So that's kind of a shift, because we're saying fungi are closer to animals, but there are plenty of differences. They're their own thing. The fungal cell walls are different than plant cell walls. For example, plant cell walls have a lot of cellulose in them, which is a polymer of glucose, whereas fungal cell walls have chitin in them, which is a polymer of a derivative of glucose. So it's N-acetylglucosamine that's derived from glucose. And interestingly, you don't see chitin in plants, but you do see it in some animals. You see it in crustaceans and insects. So again, that sort of tie of fungi to animals. Okay, fungi need to eat. They can't make their own food like plants and some bacteria. So there's no photosynthetic activity, although they partner with photosynthetic organisms in a number of ways, and we'll touch on that. So they need to get food from somewhere, and we'll talk about the various strategies that they use for that. When they eat, what I used to tell my students was animals first eat and then digest, but fungi first digest and then eat. So they actually grow into their food and secrete enzymes, and then they absorb smaller molecules that have been digested across the cell wall. So a different sort of digestive process than animals, but lots of secretion of extracellular enzymes to break down the substrate that it's growing in or on or through. Okay, and then one of the most fun morphological things about fungi is that almost all of them form filaments. Fungi form filaments. And we call these filaments hyphae, or a group of them or a network is called the mycelium. And if you've kicked over leaves in a forest or broken through some rotting wood, you've probably seen them. They can be pretty patterns and form huge networks. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the major groups of fungi. I'm not going to, and this slide is old. So I told you at the beginning that mycology is always evolving. So this slide is a few years old and it's out of date. So not everything on, we're going to talk about a couple of groups. Unfortunately, these groups don't have common names. So we're going to call these basidios, Basidiomycota, basidios, ascos, and glomeros. And that's what I'm going to talk more about today, are those three groups. And we'll leave the others for another time. And although I could take questions about things. Chytrids are interesting for other reasons. This is a slide that's sort of impossible to look at, but this is the more modern state of where we are now. Instead of 5 fungal phyla, there are 8. But ascos and basidios, those are the major ones, and they're the same. So they didn't change at all. Unfortunately, our glomeros were sort of moved down into a subphylum, and now they're in a bigger phylum called Mucoromycota. But we're just going to talk about the glomeros by themselves, not the whole Mucoromycota. We'll get back to that. Okay, so you get a picture just from all this complexity that the fungal kingdom is very diverse. There's a lot of different kinds of organisms contained in this kingdom. And about 100,000 have been described in the literature, roughly that. And I'll give you some numbers in a minute to show how they break down in the groups that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the groups that have most of this diversity. But this number that we've described is believed to be a small fraction. So an estimate, and this is an older estimate, is that there are at least 1.5 million fungi out there that we just haven't gotten around to naming and describing yet. But honestly, more modern estimates are higher, up to 5 million, 8 million. And in contrast, so the clear take home then is most fungi have yet to be discovered, right? And as a comparator, there's about 400,000 land plants that have, and we don't feel like there's 1 million more land plants out there. People are pretty good at finding those for the most part. So then let me just say that the diversity of fungi is greater than that of plants. Okay. Okay, so here is how the numbers that we have described fall. Of the 100,000, most of them are ascos, about 60,000+. Okay, and another big chunk are the basidios, 30,000+. And then the other group that we're going to talk about, the glomeros, is just really small. And these other groups are small. And the other groups that we're not even mentioning at all are also really small. Okay, so this is where most of the diversity lies. And these are the groups that make mushrooms and that we can see. Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about those. Mushrooms are what get people excited about fungi, right? Mushrooms I call the charismatic ambassadors or the fungal kingdom. So you may love to cook with them. You may love seeing them in the woods. They're something that is not microscopic and that we can appreciate more than, say, the mold growing on our orange. Okay, so mushroom biology. Mushrooms are reproductive structures from these 2 phyla, Ascomycota and Basidiomycota. Okay, now everything in these 2 phyla doesn't make mushrooms, so there's a bunch of other stuff in these phyla that we'll get to, but all of the mushrooms are in there. And there's what I showed you this poster already because I like it. It's cute. But it also illustrates the diversity. So even though we're calling them all mushrooms, there are things that are not mushroom shaped that we're going to be talking about even in using that word. So like down here, there's a coral mushroom that doesn't have a stem and a cap. Here's an earth star that may look odd and unusual and doesn't have a stem and a cap. Some shelf fungi don't have caps. So there's lots of different morphologies, and we're just going to call them all mushrooms. Anything that you could pick, we're just going to call a mushroom for tonight. Okay, so I want to talk more about the basidios, the basidiomycetes, what that means, why they're called that. So almost all the mushrooms, anything with gills is in this group. And if you were to look on the side of a gill with a microscope, you would see cells that look like this. And these 4 structures here are the 4 sexual spores from meiosis. So that's where the sexual spores are made. They're made from a cell just right on the surface of the gills. And so you can see gills provide a lot of surface area. And there's lots of other techniques that fungi have used to get lots of surface area to put their basidia. So that's what unites this group together. It's the basidios. Then the other group that makes mushrooms are the ascomycetes, ascos. And they, if we were to look in this cup fungus on the surface of inside this cup, or on the ridges and internal cavities inside this morel, or even interiorly inside this truffle, we would find that the spores are made inside of little sacs. Okay, so they're enclosed in little sacs. This is on the surface, but each spore ends up inside and has to be ejected out. And oddly, after the 4 products of meiosis, after they make 4 different sort of gametes, there's another round of mitosis. So most of them end up with 8 spores instead of 4. Not all of them, but most of them. Yes.
I was wondering, where do mushrooms like boletes and psilocybe with spores fit into here? Are they in the ascomycetes?
No, they're still in basidios. Yeah. Yep. Good question. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is the largest group of fungi, and it's got baker's yeast and a lot of molds, and then of course a few of delicious mushrooms, the morels and truffles. Okay, so those are the main groups, and we'll mention glomeros a bit later in the talk, but we will get back to them. Okay, so just to remind you, mushrooms are just reproductive structures. Okay, so like apples on a tree or tomatoes on a bush, they're not the whole organism. Okay, and in fact, we call mushrooms often fruiting bodies, just like the fruits. So but instead of a fruit making seeds, mushrooms make spores, which are microscopic, but when they are deposited en masse, you can see them here in this spore print. If you just take a mushroom and let it sit on a piece of paper for a few hours or overnight, it will usually make a nice spore deposit. And sometimes people will make art out of them and spray them with a charcoal fixative, and then it will stay on the. Okay, so microscopic spores, but then the main body of the organism is the mycelium. Okay, so we talked about mycelium already, and it seems odd that the main body is microscopic and then the reproductive part is this big thing you can see, but that's how mushrooms work. Okay, and the mycelium can be very long-lived, whereas mushrooms themselves are typically around for days or weeks, most of them. There are a few things that are perennial, like some of the conchs, some of the shelf fungi, but most of them are pretty transient, whereas the mycelium can live for years and years. Okay, so how do fungi make a living? what do they do in the environment? Excuse me, we already mentioned that fungi need to eat. Okay, they can't make food like green plants can. And so green plants are the major providers for all of us. So that's who fungi turn to first, is plants, typically. And they use three basic ways, and we're going to use mushrooms as examples of each of the basic ways that fungi get their food. So the first example are the decomposers, or saprobes. Okay, so many fungi consume dead plant debris, wood, leaf litter, and familiar examples are button mushrooms and oyster mushrooms. And it turns out this is a huge role. Okay, this is a really important role because mushrooms and other related fungi are the main decomposers of woody plant debris. Okay, so particularly woody plant debris, lignocellulosic plant debris, bacteria contribute somewhat, but it's far and away a fungal job. And as you can imagine, nutrient cycling and recycling is critical to keep things going. If everything gets locked up in dead wood, then those nutrients aren't available for other organisms. So fungi, by breaking things down, contribute to the soil. All the organic matter is basically the work of fungal degradation of other components. So here's a paper that I just threw in. We're not going to go through it. Phylotype diversity within soil fungal functional groups drives ecosystem stability. Here, they looked at soils and looked at the different kinds of fungi that were in them, and they found when there were a lot of different kinds of fungal decomposers in the soil, that those ecosystems tended to be more stable to drought, that they could recover and come back. Whereas in contrast, if there were more pathogens in the soil and fewer decomposers, those ecosystems would often change after drought. So after a drought, maybe the bushes and plants wouldn't come back and it would just switch to a grassland. So less stable ecosystem. Okay. So they really make a big role. Well, so some fungi don't wait for the plants to die. Okay, so they want that plant material, but they're in a little more of a hurry. So those plants go after, those fungi go after living plants and act as parasites or pathogens. And the example that I used here are honey mushrooms, Armillaria mellia, which some of you may know, or Armillaria oysterae is the one we have more commonly here. It's an edible mushroom. It doesn't taste like honey, but it's an edible mushroom if you cook it well. And it is a pathogen. It kills trees. So let's talk briefly about fungi as pathogens. So fungi as decomposers play a huge role, right? They really occupy that niche. It's a very important niche. They're a major player. It's the same with fungi as pathogens, okay? 70 to 85% of plant pathogens are fungi, and thousands, tens of thousands of species can be plant pathogens, okay? Up to 20% of global food crops are lost each year due to fungal processes, along with an additional 10% post-harvest due to mold and losing grain and such. So it's a big deal. They're out there and important, and they affect our lives whether we know it or not. Fungi can also be pathogens of animals. So you may have heard of white nose syndrome in bats, which has reached Colorado, unfortunately. Chytridiomycosis in amphibians. we didn't talk about the group chytrids. That's a separate phylum, but this is a very serious disease of frogs and salamanders, and has wiped out entire species in a lot of places in both of the Americas, but it's worldwide now. And there are human pathogens as well. We're not going to talk about any of those tonight unless there's questions. There's interesting biology with cordyceps and a number of other species in insects. So fungi can be pathogens of animals as well as plants. But yes.
Really quick on that last slide, that first option you talked about, it's trichomycosis. Does that, I've never heard of that. Does that produce a fruiting body as well? Or?
No, it's the whole organism is microscopic. So chytrids are an interesting group. Their spores can swim. They have little tails, and they're called zoospores, and they swim through water and wet soil. And then they make little lesions on skin of salamanders and frogs, and they affect the skin's ability to breathe, basically. Yes.
Got the real toads, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Anything that you've heard that's been dying off is because of chytridiomycosis. Usually people will just call it BD rather than Batrachochytrium dendrobatidis, because it's too hard to say. Okay. So in many ways, for a lot of people, the most interesting kind of niche is this third one of symbionts and mutualists, where both parties are getting something out of it, okay? And there are a number of different instances of this, including lichens, but what I want to talk about most tonight are mycorrhizae. And the word mycorrhizae means fungal roots, but what they are is an intimate relationship between hyphae or mycelium and plant roots in which nutrients go both ways. So fungal mycelium has so much more surface area than plant roots because we're a single cell thick and all that branching. So there's a huge surface area, and you can collect a lot more water and minerals. But it's not just passive. It turns out that, so in terms of what the fungus is providing to the plant, it's not just absorbing things. Phosphorus is a great example. Phosphorus has really poor mobility in the soil. It tends to bind to things and not be easily soluble. Fungi secrete a variety of organic acids that can actually dissolve it out of rock. So things like citric acid, oxalic acid, glucuronic acid, there are others. These are organic acids that are secreted into the media by the fungus the same way they secrete enzymes, and can dissolve the phosphate out of rock and bring it up and make it available for the plant in a way that the plant never had access to. And then they have another set of some of those digestive enzymes can break down carbon that's locked up in large molecules that roots wouldn't have, and nitrogen that roots wouldn't have access to either. So they're able to metabolize and generate nutrients that the trees and bushes would never be able to get. And in return, they get sugar and food from photosynthate, basically, from the roots. So it's this wonderful partnership. And it turns out not only does it sound good, it's essential, okay? We really need it. Oh, I'll get to that. Here's a different slide. It's also fun. It's also fun because it turns out that in the mushrooms involved, so not all of the fungi that do this make mushrooms, but a number of them do, and the mushrooms involved can't be cultivated. So mycorrhizal fungi that make these relationships with trees, we can't reproduce that and grow these things. These turn out to be some of our favorite wild mushrooms, things like porcini, Boletus edulis, chanterelles, truffles. Here's a photo I took many years ago now of white truffles being sold for $375 an ounce, right? Truffles are the diamonds of the kitchen. So these things, which are among the very most delicious of fungi, have to be collected from the wild. There's no other source for them. So mycorrhiza are great in that regard because they provide these wonderful, tasty treats for us. But it turns out the whole forest needs them to survive. A pine tree cannot grow to maturity in the wild without having mycorrhizal connections. They just can't pick up enough of the things they need. In a pot, if you fertilize one, you can get it to grow. But out in the wild, the soils are much less forgiving and providing, and things don't work. So, and it's not just pines, it's firs, and it's most of the conifers, a lot of hardwoods as well, require mycorrhizal. So the forests require fungi, is the bottom line. This is a big deal. And so mycorrhizae are fun to think about, and they're interesting because they have a number of fun features. It turns out that a single tree can make these mycorrhizal associations with more than one kind of fungus. So these roots over here might be talking to Boletus edulis, and these roots over here might be in a relationship with chanterelles. It could happen. Or some other things that don't make edible mushrooms. There's a lot of russulas and other species that are maybe not so delicious, but that are really important for ecosystem function. Yes.
Sorry, I got questions.
No, it's great.
I was wondering, does it get to a point where the trees spread too thin and there's too many species, or is it usually just a few that make sense?
Oh, how many species of fungi can a tree make relationships with? That's a great question. I don't know the answer. It's a little bit surprising. There have been some studies where when you look by DNA at what's on the roots, it's different than what you find when you pick mushrooms that you know. So you see a lot of things that don't make mushrooms that are more abundant even than the things that do.
That makes sense.
Yeah. But it's more than a handful. I mean, it might be 10 or 20 different kinds of things, or even more. Yeah.
In that scenario, did the mushrooms fight with each other and compete?
That's a great question. That's a great question. There is a little bit of evidence. It's been argued that sometimes they do. For example, there's the most deadly mushroom in Europe and North America is called Amanita phalloides, the death cap. That mushroom is a European species that was introduced into North America inadvertently, just on plant roots of potted plants that people were moving back and forth. And it's on both coasts now, and I was just told a couple of weeks ago that we have found it in Colorado Springs. So before that, I used to say it's not found in Colorado yet, but it probably will be. But it may be that it's already. In any case, that mushroom, there are places in California where some of the state parks, for example, where you can go and that is the main mushroom, the most abundant mushroom that you see. And people there are worried that in fact it has sort of pushed out some other mycorrhizal associates and it's acting in kind of a weedy invasive species manner. which is odd for a mycorrhizal thing to be able to do that, but that's the way it seems to be. It seems to be very aggressive, that particular species at least. So a single tree can have associations with different species of fungi, and a single fungal mycelium, so we think of a big mat of fungi, can make associations with different trees, including different species. So you could be attached to a pine tree over here and attached to a fir tree over there. So it's this big network. And so a name was given a number of years ago, the Wood Wide Web, sort of like the World Wide Web, that forests are tied together by the mycelium that's going between trees. And in this particular paper, which made a big splash when it came out in '97, Suzanne Simard and her colleagues showed that actually significant amounts of carbon could move between trees. So we think, I mean, the mycorrhizae want carbon, but you don't think of it going the other way back up into a tree through the mycelium. So it's coming from one tree through mycelium back up into another tree in measurable amounts, not in gigantic amounts, but in measurable amounts that they felt were significant. And this could even happen between different species of trees. So net transfer of carbon between ectomycorrhizal tree species in the field. So that was a big surprise. That was more kinds of connectivity than people had previously imagined. And people still fight over the amounts and how much does this really matter? And it's
yeah, this tree is noting that this tree needs more carbon.
How does it actually work? Well, some people get a little too much into the intentionality aspect. But a better way to think of it is more like sources and sinks. So if something is sucking a lot, is really desperate, and things just kind of flow one way, whereas someone else has plenty to go around and it flows in and maybe moves through the fungus to somewhere that just is more desperate. But Suzanne Simard has this idea of the mother tree. She's written a book that was pretty popular, you may have seen. And the idea is that a mature, well-established tree can actually help its seedlings survive by being that big source of carbon that can allow flow into littler seedlings that may not quite be able to make it on their own. So that's her concept, and it's a fun concept. It's not without some discussion. There are people who yes.
So what's it for the fungus to be the conduit to take carbon from mama to baby?
Yeah, why should a fungus give away the carbon once it's got a hold of it? Because the fungus wants it, right? I mean, so why should it ever let go? Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that it has a choice. I think things are being sucked. I think there's just movement across channels that, yeah. No, it's a good question. What I think it's not is I don't think the mycelium in the forest is a synaptic network of neural connections sending messages through. I don't think that's, and a lot of people like that idea and find it really appealing that it's this, mind in the forest that's thinking what should go where. I think it's more who's desperate and pulls harder versus who's not desperate and is willing to donate. And somehow the fungus is just ending up in between. The fungus wants to be sure it gets what it needs, but if I'll tell you in a minute, plants can pull things out of fungi that you wouldn't expect. Okay, so so it turns out, I think we're good on time. I'd probably, yeah, we're plenty good on time. So I said that it's not a network of neurons sending messages to each other, but there is communication that can go on. There are things happening that that make it seem like that. Okay, so here are a few papers that came out within the last couple decades. Underground signals carried through common mycelial networks warn neighboring plants of an aphid attack. So if one plant is being eaten by aphids, it will generate chemicals to try and deter the aphids. Some of those chemicals get into the roots, and some of those get into the fungi and move through. And another plant, when it sees those chemicals, it says, oh, I guess it's time for me to start making these anti-aphid chemicals, the same kind of thing. So, or here's another one, fungal fast lane. Common mycorrhizal networks extend bioactive zones of allelochemicals in soil. Allelochemicals are things that some kinds of plants put out into the ground to discourage competitors. So it doesn't bother their own species, but it sort of inhibits other species from growing too close. And this paper said that when there's fungal connections, it can spread those chemicals out a little farther than they would spread without having the fungal connections here. And then the third one I put on this slide, interplant communication of tomato plants through underground common mycorrhizal networks. So again, the same kind of thing. I mean, plants can communicate through the air as well. They make volatile compounds that can diffuse through the air. So that, and it makes sense that those same compounds can be in roots and might get picked up by fungi if they're small enough and can cross the membranes and cell walls. Okay, well, so a fungal internet is this picture that we've developed, but it turns out it's really actually two different internets that aren't connected. So there's actually two different kinds of mycorrhizae, two basic kinds, and they're made with different kinds of fungi, and they connect to different kinds of plants. Together, they connect to almost every plant out there. So they're really important, but I wanted to go through them both briefly. So what we've talked about so far are mushroom-forming fungi, basidios and ascos, and they make a kind of mycorrhizae that's called ectomycorrhizae, and they do that mostly with trees and shrubs, woody plants. Okay, so as I said, pines and firs and a lot of bushes, a lot of hardwood trees, but not all hardwood trees and not all even conifers. For example, juniper and cedar do this other kind. What else? Maple trees do this other kind. Okay, so they're on the other internet. So let's talk about this internet. So first one, this ecto means outside of. These, all this blue are mycelium penetrating into the root in between cells and wrapping around cells, making a sort of network so that there's a lot of surface area for things to flow back and forth. Okay, so they move into the root a certain amount, but they stay outside of individual cells. The other group, glomeros, which I'll talk just a little bit more about, glomeros don't stay outside the cell. Glomeros are more invasive, and they make relationship with grasses and lots of soft plants, herbaceous plants, almost everything out there that's not in this group has a relationship with glomeros. It's not every single plant family, but the ones that don't do it are way easier to list than the hundreds and hundreds that do. So a notable example that doesn't is the mustard family. Mustard family doesn't do this, but almost anything else you can name does. So in this case, the fungus is actually going right into the cell, and it makes this elaboration, kind of a branched structure called an arbuscle. And that's where the interface, that's where exchange takes place. So it penetrates through the cell wall. It doesn't penetrate through the cell membrane. It turns out there's actually a plant cell membrane all the way around. So it's like putting a hand in a rubber glove. It's that branching kind of process. Okay, so a bit about this group, the glomeros, which are no longer glomeromycota, they're glomeromycotina. They've been demoted to a subphylum instead of a phylum. But they make these connections, arbuscular mycorrhizae. And down here, this is an arbuscle in a cell that's been cracked open. So these are cell walls of the plant. And this whole elaboration is one of those branched arbuscular structures inside the plant cell. So these require plants. They won't grow without them. You can't grow, and we haven't been able to grow them in culture without plants. You can co-culture them with plant roots in some systems, but they require plants. We haven't figured out how to make that work otherwise. They're also really interesting in a number of other ways, and I won't go into all of them. One interesting thing is we don't know how or even if this group has sex. Sexual reproduction has never been described in this group, although it's been looked for, and there are still a lot of the genes that are used for sexual reproduction in other organisms. Those genes look still active, but we haven't found how it works or even if it works. And there are other fungi that don't have sex, which is an odd thing. Some kinds of molds, some of things like penicillium, well, there's a set of molds that really don't seem to use sexual reproduction anymore. They just reproduce asexually. So this group might be in that kind of a situation, but we don't know. People have argued about it. And
That would be an evolutionary advantage. They don't need to find any other plants, they just go ahead, right?
you can argue it both ways. You can argue it both ways. Yeah, the argument, there is, I won't go into them all tonight, but there are arguments for sex as well. Yeah. And it turns out this is a gigantic set of connections. About almost every plant out there has these kinds of things. So it's just woody things mostly that are in the other group. And so we need our forests. Those are critical for our forest, but not even everything in the forest, because I listed some trees and things that are not in that group. So those two groups together really interact with almost every plant out there, and can be really critical for survival. Okay, what else do I want to say? Oh, I want to tell you about a funny thing about mycorrhiza. This is an interesting. We were talking about when a fungus gets hold of carbon from a plant, why should it give it up to another plant? And I don't know the answer, but here's a good example of that working in a different way. Mycorrhizal heterotrophism. This is when a plant mycorrhizal partner cheats. So there's a whole set of plants which we used to call saprophytic. They don't have chlorophyll, they're not green. And we used to think that they decomposed forest matter and just lived that way. They don't have any enzymes. They don't have any way to break anything down. What they do is they have mycorrhizal connections, and they just get all of their nutrition from the fungus. Now, the fungus has to be getting its carbon from some other plant who actually does photosynthesize and contribute. But this is just a one-way street for these guys. They are just acting in a sort of parasitic way. So these plants rely on mycorrhiza for everything, And there are some really interesting members. So this phenomena is called mycorrhizal heterotrophism. Or just mycorrhizal cheating. So here's a beautiful species that some of you may have seen out in the wood, coral root, out in the woods, coral root orchids. So they're in this group of mycorrhizal cheaters. They're beautiful. They need to get all of their nutrients via a fungus from something else, okay, from a tree or a bush somewhere else, okay. So the exploited partner, clearly needs to be getting carbon from somewhere, needs to be getting photosynthate sugar. So it has to be a three-way partnership. But these guys are not contributing anything. And not just this orchid. It turns out that orchids in general do a weird thing with their seeds, okay? When we think of seeds, often we think of grains or nuts or sunflower seeds, some nutritious thing where the plant has put a lot of food in there for the little seedling to use until it gets established. Orchids don't do that at all. Orchids don't put any food into their seeds. Their little seedlings are totally on their own, and in order to survive, they have to make a mycorrhizal connection. They have to find a fungus that's not just going to kill them, and that sometimes happens. The fungus will just kill them, but they have to find a fungus willing to make this mycorrhizal connection in order to get enough nutrients to grow. And then some kinds of orchids just keep that going forever and never, but even orchids that are photosynthetic start out that way. So even green orchids that are, so they start out just taking, and eventually they can contribute back if they're green, but some never. So the whole family, the orchid family, is gigantic. I mean, it's one of the biggest plant families out there. And yes.
Are there fungi in the?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a great question. There don't have to be, because it turns out you can take orchid seeds and grow them on nutrient agar. So as long as you give them food from somewhere, then they can grow. The way they get their food out in the wild, they have to have a mycorrhizae. But if you just grow them on agar with nutrients in it, they'll sprout and be happy. And then you can get them past the stage, where they're green enough to make their own food. Okay, so that's kind of a fun thing. And it's not just orchids. Here's a few other things that fall into that group that you may have seen out there. Pine drops. This is essentially a parasite of this sort of pseudo truffle called rhizopogon. Here's another one, Indian pipes, which you may have seen, which can be either pink or white. They require things in the Russula or Lactarius genera.
Yeah, so for most of these, you said saprophytic plants.
Yeah, they're not saprophytes. They're parasites. So yeah, that's what we figured out. Yeah.
Did they just grow and then die and come back each year, or do they live in the soil and there's not a?
There's a base that lives there each year, so it comes back from the base each year. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Okay, I think this is most of what I wanted to say. Oh no, this is not the only symbiosis out there. There are lots of other fungal symbiosis, and I need to mention some just briefly. Fungal endophytes are when it turns out that fungi and bacteria both, in wild plants, some fungi and bacteria live in between the cells. So basically the same way we have a gut flora, we have microbes inside us, they have microbes inside them, just in kind of different places, okay? And in some cases, the fungus is doing something useful for the plant. In other cases, not. It can be variable. And of course, lichens are huge, and I'm not going to say anything more about them tonight, even though I should. The lichens are this incredible partnership with either a photosynthetic algae or photosynthetic cyanobacteria, or sometimes both actually can be in the same lichen, and that enables both of those components of the symbiosis to live in places where neither would be able to live otherwise. And lichens are huge in terms of beginning soil, and there's a lot to say about lichens, and I'm going to shortchange you tonight. Okay, and there are also symbioses with animals. Interesting. So termites make at least in more tropical climates in India and Africa, termites make a symbiosis with a species called Termitomyces that makes these wonderful mushrooms. And the termites provide wood that they've chewed up, and the mycelium lives on that. And then in return, the termites get some little mushroom bits, some little fungal bits that are sort of specially produced to be eaten. And there's also mushrooms that are big mushrooms that are harvested and sold. That are, I should have put a picture in because they're so pretty, but I didn't. Okay, leafcutter ants, the same kind of thing. They make a fungal garden. They cut leaves, bring them down into their den. There's a particular fungus that they cultivate. That fungus is the only thing they eat. They don't eat the leaves. And the fungus is very happy. It's being fed all the time. So bark beetles, ambrosia beetles, and then big herbivores, cows and deer and all the big herbivores that are plant eaters, right? They have a little unusual set of fungi, neocalymastomycetes, which are anaerobic, but which break down cellulose. And there's a lot of interesting features about them, but they live in the gut and help the animal digest things it couldn't digest, and in turn they're getting fed. So so that's all I want to say. I'll take some questions in a minute. Yes, I'll take one question right now.
Okay, so the pine bark beetle that we have
Carries a fungus with the blue stain fungus, which are actually several different fungi. It's not just one. There's about 3 or 4 different blue stain fungi.
And the larva eat the fungus.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And the channeling throughout the, yep. Yeah. Okay, so just a few conclusions. Fungi are an extremely diverse kingdom with critically important ecosystem interactions with other organisms. They're the major decomposers of lignocellulosic plant debris. They form mycorrhizal relationships with 80 to 90% of land plants essential for forest and other ecosystems. Fungi are major plant pathogens as well. It's not all a good side, and agents of food spoilage. And we continue to learn both new species of fungi, most remain undescribed, and new fungal roles in the environment. We're learning all the time. Thank you. I'd be happy to take more questions. Yes.
Fungi always grow in wettish kinds of environments.
Water is what, so the question is, do fungi always grow in wettish kinds? More fungi will grow in wet places than dry places. They need some water, but there are even fungi that grow in deserts. Yeah. In fact, there's a truffle that's a desert truffle that it has its mycorrhizal association with a small bush that's just teeny, and those truffles are collected and sold commercially. There's a thought that, I have slides of this in other talks. There's a picture of manna from heaven. It's thought that those were the desert truffles that people would collect, this source of food that came out of nowhere. Yes.
Area losing fungi, going to a dry grassland? And would that mean that when those areas are rehabilitated, for lack of a better word, getting more wet or moisture, more water vapor on the landscape, do they then get more fungi then?
That's a great question. So it's too long for me to repeat, but I hope people heard it. In areas that have changed due to overgrazing or other pressures, and have lost a lot of their riparian plant life, and subsequently a lot of the fungi, how do they recover? How does that come back? If there's more water, there will be more fungi. That's definitely the case. And they will move in from adjacent areas too. So yeah, it's not totally barren, but if the area's big enough, it's hard. I mean, in places that were historically deforested in Europe, they tried replanting trees for a long time and could never get them to grow until they figured out they needed to actually inoculate with a mycelial partner, and then they could get trees to grow. So they wouldn't repopulate, because it had been so long since trees were in that area that there weren't any remaining in the soil, because those kinds of fungi need the tree. I mean, they can hang out around with dead roots for a while. So if you cut trees and replant quickly, they'll still come back and grow. But if it's too long in between, then it's a problem. Yes, another question.
So if I just want to identify mushrooms that I see in the area, do you have a source that you like? Or divine?
Probably the best book is by Vera Evanson from the Botanical Garden, the Denver Botanical Garden. And she's written 3 books. Her first one is called Colorado Mushrooms, but that's the oldest. Don't get that one. The next book is Mushrooms of the Rocky Mountain region, and that's the book to get. And then she's also written a 3rd book in collaboration with Kathy Cripps out of Montana, which is, I don't remember the exact title, but it's Mushrooms by Habitat. So if you're in lodgepole pine forest, what are the kinds of mushrooms that you might see? If you're in a grassy meadow, what are the kinds of mushrooms? And that's a fun book too. Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you just a super simple question, but then also make a comment on what you said. I have an app called Seek on my phone. It's not completely accurate all the time with mushrooms, and I definitely have to go back and double check with like a real guide. But a lot of the time it works without internet. You can just take a picture and scan a mushroom, and it will tell you, and plants too, and animals, what they are.
That's
the
the
species.
one, is I looked it up.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's like European, and mine doesn't quite look like that.
Yeah.
Yes, I will say you absolutely cannot rely on an app in terms of identifying something that you're thinking of eating. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, it doesn't, right? If we go out and misname a wildflower, nothing bad happens, right? And if you're just trying to put a name on something, it's okay if it's not right. But if you're gonna eat it, that's not the way to do that. And I have whole other talks about how to proceed in that regard. Yeah.
Mushrooms, fungi like wetter areas, what about colder?
Cold is a limit. So things shut down in the winter. They can still live, but they can't really grow much when the temperature is below freezing. Interestingly, though, temperate forests, so like North America and deeper in south, have more kinds of mushrooms even than tropical forests. But tropical forests, there are other kinds of fungi that don't bother making mushrooms, and things turn over so fast. But in temperate forests, it's really the wood rotting fungi that are critical in temperate forests. There's nothing else that rots those trees, and yeah.
I just wanted to ask what your favorite edible mushroom is.
I never limit it to a single one. I like all the things we've talked about, chanterelles and boletes and truffles the few times I've had them. There are so many great things out there. Yeah, yeah.
It's a crazy question, I think, but um, National Public Radio had a program at one point, and I was listening in the car, so I hope I got this right, but it sounded like they were trying to create out of a mushroom place a computer that was organic.
Wow, that's really interesting. No, no, I don't. I don't know what that's about.
So I couldn't wait to see if somebody else had heard that.
Yeah,
was,
yeah.
Wrong place or something.
That fun to think about, but I don't know the story behind it, so I can't explain.
So, really, yeah, so far out there.
I can talk about lots of other uses that people have found for mycelium, but I don't know that one. Yes.
Kind of a broad question, but climate change, global warming, what impact might that have? Because if cold doesn't increase their growth, but do we have any evidence that that's affecting any of these?
Well, I think it's mostly not good, unfortunately. Here we worry more about droughts, right? Or droughts and floods. So things happen either too fast or not enough. And the heat means less moisture stays in the soil. And you really need that moisture in the soil in order for fungi to be happy, which is also what you need for the plants to be happy. So it's trouble, I'm afraid. Yeah. Yes.
If there are groups of scientists that harvest spores and things like that, so that we can have a continuous, I don't know, almost cloning of mushrooms in case of scarcity of them in some place, like we do seeds.
Right, right. So that's a really interesting idea. I am not aware of anything on a large basis. All of the things that are cultivated for food commercially, there are frozen stocks of those things, and including in liquid nitrogen, and those are well secured and taken care of. But in terms of wild things out there, a lot of the things we can't even grow, I don't think anyone is making an effort to collect and save those spores.
And this is how I found is the mushroom festival,
Mm-hmm.
like a 2-day long thing. Would you tell
Oh, there are several mushroom festivals out there. So I usually participate in a couple every year. There's an Eagle Mushroom Festival, and they're usually always in August, and they get it. And the Eagle Mushroom Festival, people go out in forays, and then there's a lot of cooking classes and such. It's a lot of fun. And then there's a Telluride Mushroom Festival that I also go to. And the Telluride Mushroom Festival attracts a lot of people for several reasons. One, because it's in Telluride and it's, drop dead gorgeous. So people from all over come there. And it's become the largest mushroom festival in North America because of that. The other thing that's sort of unique to the Telluride Mushroom Festival is they embrace people there embrace the idea of magic mushrooms and psilocybin containing mushrooms and talk about them a lot and encourage that. And most other mushroom fairs try to just say, we don't talk about that. We don't want to think about that. And we're just on the up and up. We don't, and Telluride has always been saying, this is fine. Let's talk about it. So that attracts a whole contingent of people who are interested in that aspect of mushrooms as well.
What are those beautiful things?
Oh, isn't that pretty? Those are mushrooms that I grew myself in my basement. This is a pretty little foliota that is grown for food. It's an Asian mushroom. It goes by the name here of either chestnut mushroom or cinnamon cap. It's Foliota adiposa is one of the names that's given to it, but we have a mushroom here that's called Foliota adiposa that's different. So that's kind of screwed up the name of it. Yeah. But it's a cultivated mushroom that you can find. For example, Hazeldale Mushroom Farms, not far from us, grows this mushroom sometimes. Yeah. Yes.
I just wonder if there's any crossbreeding or hybridization. I know you said they're hard to cultivate, which would make it hard, but I just.
It does, yes and no. So do mushrooms hybridize? They can under some conditions. So there is a yellow oyster mushroom, golden oyster mushroom, Pleurotus citrino-pileatus, that is cultivated widely, and it's one of the things you can buy. And so it's a perfectly nice and very pretty mushroom that has become an invasive species in much of Eastern North America. And in some case, yeah, so it can grow outside and it's very happy, and it's become really dominant in some areas. And it only attacks dead things. So it's just but it's occupying a niche that other things would occupy if it wasn't there. So it's invasive in that regard. That seems to be able to hybridize with some native Pleurotus species. And in the laboratory in Japan, people have forced a hybridization between two different species of oyster mushroom and made a hybrid species that's now cultivated commercially. It has kind of intermediate properties between both of them, and is called the black pearl oyster.
Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for spending time with us, and I can tell by all the questions, everybody is intrigued. So thanks so much, Ken.
You are very welcome.